So, welcome everyone. Today we'll be talking about advanced floodplain administration, and I'm Ceil Strauss. I'm the Minnesota State Floodplain Manager, and I'll be presenting today. And I've got Ricky Hoffman helping me. Hey, Ricky, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ricky Hoffman. I am relatively 6 months new. I don't know what the acceptable date range is that I can stop saying that, but I'm 6 months new to the organization. 7 months now. I work with Ceil, Gary, and Gary in the floodplain program. Gary's not available for today's meeting, so I'm sitting in for him. I predominantly work with ordnance review, both with the floodplain program as well as our shoreland and river related programs.
Thanks. So, yeah, Ricky will be watching chat. You guys can unmute yourselves, but we ask that you save that for the end when we do question and answers. Please feel free to put questions in the chat. And if they're timely questions, we'll try and answer those right away. And Ricky will help watch the chat. And then at the end, we can stop recording and ask more specific questions if you guys want to hang around and ask more complicated things for your communities. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off at this point and focus on the presentation. So we will do some review of what needs permits and what's required for all permits, but we're hoping to concentrate more on the unusual situations, conditional use permits, flood proofing for those situations, and a little bit about variances and legal implications. So a reminder that the federal regulations say that permits are required for all construction and other development within the Zone A on your community floodplain maps. Definition of development is very broad. It certainly includes buildings and other structures, but it includes any kind of mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, any kind of man-made projects in the floodplain. When we talk about a permit, if it's a building and you've got building code, you'd be giving a building permit, but otherwise you might call it something else. You might call it a land alteration permit, a floodplain permit. Many communities just call them zoning permits or grading permits or something along those lines. Doesn't matter what you call it, any kind of permit works. The other thing is that you can consider waiving fees if it's something you wouldn't normally require a permit for or have reduced fees or something. And then also noting that there are times when a DNR permit would be required for the same work, and you don't need to require a separate permit if the DNR permit's required. Reminder that the area adjacent to the FEMA mapped floodplain that's below the base flood elevation is subject to zoning. That's based on state rule that even if the FEMA map wasn't accurate and didn't show, say, this low area here in the floodplain, your ordinance requires you to be regulating that. We do talk about how the area that FEMA shows on the maps, your ordinance also says that you're regulating any area that's within that FEMA mapped area. So you might have a situation like this where it's really high and they could go ahead and put in a basement and they'd still be meeting the minimum elevations. But officially you're regulating the areas shown on the FEMA map and adjacent to the FEMA mapped area that's are below the flood elevations. Those of you who have shoreland ordinances, you're regulating for shoreland within 1,000 feet of lakes, within 300 feet of basically any public water courses, those that drain more than 2 square miles, or to the edge of the map floodplain if that goes further. And in addition to the setbacks and other minimum requirements you have in your shoreland regs, remember that within the whole shoreland district, you have minimum low floor requirements that are basically the same as those in the floodplain district. So what standards apply really depend on the kind of development and whether it's in the floodway or the flood fringe. In this presentation, we're not getting into what floodway versus flood fringe is, but just remember that the floodway is the area where we expect higher flows, greater flood depths, and in detailed study areas, they're shown on the FEMA maps. And then the flood fringe is the area outside the floodway that is shown as part of the floodplain on those detailed study areas. In the areas where we don't have detailed study areas, we're treating everything as floodway unless you have an engineer determine where that floodway versus the flood fringe is, or you use one of the other techniques that are accepted engineering practices. And we gave a training on dealing with A zones last week, and you can see a recording of that if you'd like more information on that. But buildings are treated differently depending on whether they're in the floodway or flood fringe. And then all these other kinds of projects that need to be evaluated, they'll be treated differently whether they're in the floodway or flood fringe. We do have 2 sample permit forms. One, the full application form is for projects that involve buildings. And then we have a more simplified one that doesn't have as many questions there for other kinds of development. So those things that involve grading, culverts, bridges, non-building kinds of structures, etc. For buildings, if they're in the floodway, well, we can't have any new primary buildings or habitable buildings or expansions to existing buildings. You can do maintenance of the existing non-conforming buildings as long as there's no substantial improvement or substantial damage. And then the only new buildings that can go in are certain buildings that are accessory to open space uses, or there's a few things mentioned in the state rules like they're accessory to navigation or other water necessary uses. But the park shelter is the most common type of building that we're going to see going into a floodway as a new building. In the flood fringe, the buildings are allowed, but any new ones either have to be elevated on fill, or if they're an accessory that's less than or equal to 576 square feet, they can be wet flood proofed. But again, only if they're an accessory and you're only using them for parking and storage. The other thing you can do is an alternative elevation method. We'll be talking about that more here today. And a CUP, conditional use permits required if it's a residential building. For additions in the flood fringe, they must meet the standards. They must meet those minimum elevations. If they are substantially improved or substantially damaged, then they must be brought in compliance as if they're a new building. And we do have separate trainings talking more about nonconformities, and I've got a link to that at the end. So, is it a new building versus an existing building? And here in the cartoon, they're working on a project and talking about we're going to open the wall, find that illegal wiring, and have to replace all these things that the previous owners left. And next thing you know, you're into substantial improvement. So that is something you need to look at with the older buildings, is whether it's a substantial improvement or substantial damage. If there had been a flood or tornado or something, that substantial damage is not just for flooding, it is for any kind of damage, whether it's a fire, we do see that fairly often, or tornadoes. If it's in the floodplain and it's substantially damaged, then they need to be building them in compliance with as if they were a new building. In our sample permit application forms, the first couple pages are for the applicant to talk about what they're going to do. But then we have some pages that are intended for you as local officials to help give you some guidance and look at some of the questions that we're asking here to make sure it's meeting the requirements. Here in the first page that would be for the local official, it's got whether it's in the floodplain or not. And if it is in the floodplain, is it in the floodway, the flood fringe, or is it a general floodplain? And then, is it an allowable use, or does it require a conditional use permit? And then for buildings or for the types of structures that we need to know the flood elevations, we've got these details. What's that base flood elevation? what's the stage increase at that location, and what's the freeboard. And that's either going to be the minimum state freeboard of a foot, or your community may have a higher standard. And datum is really important because that can be up to 1.4 feet different in Minnesota. Most of the older information's in the 29 datum, the NGVD. New FEMA maps and newer information in general's in the 88 datum. So really important to be looking at the datum and making sure you're comparing apples to apples. And we have a place here to note, what was your source for the base flood elevation and the stage increase? Did it come from the FEMA map and the flood insurance study, or was it based on our supporting cross sections that we have for many of the A zones, or some other special study or an estimate that DNR helped you out with? You want to be including all that information in your application forms. And some of the standards that do apply for all projects, and that language is in section 4 of our model ordinance, that everything needs to be anchored, needs to be flood resistant materials below the regulatory flood protection elevation. Utilities need to be elevated or properly flood proofed up to the regulatory flood protection elevation. And you need to look at, is that project going to be detrimental to adjoining areas? Are you shoving water onto adjoining areas? Are you allowing for adequate drainage lines around there? And you're not restricting flood carrying capacity. And you get into that, especially if there's a swale, there's a drainage way that goes through a property. You don't want to be blocking that water from being able to go through that property and flooding the folks that are upstream. In the Minnesota rules, we have more language about pollutants, basically. You can't store things that are buoyant, flammable, explosive, or that could be injurious to human, animal, or plant life. Also, there's language about things that are considered pollutants in there. And we do, in this section here of our sample ordinance, have a place to look at, are those things addressed in that particular proposed development? And a few of them apply for buildings in particular, and many of them apply for anything that you're doing in the floodplain. The other thing that happens is you need to look at, are they meeting allowable rise? Are they causing an increase in the flood stage, the flood elevations? And if you're in a FEMA mapped floodway, they've mapped that area where we're very stringent about what happens in that area, that they've already taken into account that the rest of the floodplain's filled. So we really have to leave that floodway open for when the floods come through. If you're in the floodway, then you can't be causing any rise. And we'll be having another slide or two about that. But in areas where you don't have a floodway, or in a zone A, then you need to show that it's meeting the allowable rise. So again, zone AE, where we've had a floodway, we have to show no rise, which is 0.00 foot of rise. And in places where we don't have a floodway mapped, you need to document that it won't cause more than that half a foot rise. That's the most Minnesota law allows. And Minnesota law says any increase can't increase flood damage potential, which we interpret as it's not touching insurable structures. We do have a sample no-rise certification for these situations where it is in a floodway. Again, FEMA rules say you can't have any filling, and they specify that 0.00 feet. Decades ago, they were more flexible. They would say as long as it's less than a tenth of a foot. But unfortunately, people took advantage of that, and they would put in 0.04 feet, and then 0.04 feet, and they just keep putting in minimal amounts of fill so that cumulatively it ended up being an increase in that area. It should normally be done by an engineer, a professional engineer, or there's a few situations where it can be satisfied through other engineering practices. One would be you can document you're returning the site to the previous grade, that You've got documentation of what the cross sections were before. There was some erosion there. You're just restoring what was there. And some backwater areas and some ineffective flow areas. And again, we talked about that in our dealing with A zone presentation. But it's important that the community keeps this document on file for basically the life of that project. We ask that you provide a copy to DNR. Not officially a requirement, but we do appreciate that you provide a copy of that to us, especially if there was an update done to the model in that area. And it is officially the community's responsibility to determine if that information's adequate. DNR staff, we will help with the review, but it's not the same depth that we do when there's a letter of map revision or a conditional letter of map revision. We have to give a more thorough review and do an approval letter. For the no rise, if you see red flags, that's a time when it's good to bring us in. Or if you're just not comfortable with reviewing these things, you can bring us in to take a quicker look at the situation. Some things to keep in mind. If you're reading the memo of that professional engineer and they're using fudge words like, oh, the stage increase is insignificant, or it's not much, or it's minimal, or there's hardly any, or anything like that, that is not acceptable. They need to be showing that there's no rise, 0.00 feet. And we don't want to see it rounded to the 10th of a foot. We want to see it to the 100th there. And it's not just acceptable to show no net filling, except in some of the basin areas that be acceptable. But if it's any place with conveyance, then just showing no net filling is not acceptable. They can be doing some other things, again, comparing to current conditions. But if there's any complications, you can loop us in and we'll help review it. So here we've got a floodway. This is cross section. The river's over here. But during floods, it's going to be covering this whole area. Let's say this is kind of the natural floodplain, but we've got a road that was put in, maybe it's a railroad, whatever it is. So the water's coming down, and let's say the engineer says, well, okay, I'm removing this area that's above the base flood elevation. I'm going to add it in here right next to the river below the base flood elevation, but I'm balancing my fill. Well, that's not an acceptable analysis. First of all, you're looking at things above the BFE versus below. And of course, if you're taking it from over here on the very edge of the floodplain, there's going to be less velocity and more impact as you get closer to the river. So that's not the best drawing there, but giving an idea of why we don't accept just them saying, oh, I'm just balancing the fill, so I'm okay. That's not acceptable in a riverine situation, a flow situation. But if you were going the other way, yeah, if you were taking maybe the road was closer here and you're going to pull it back and put it higher, that'd be something that you wouldn't necessarily have to do some of the modeling. We do have a part on the application form, our sample form, to look at some of these things and check off, did they attach a no-rise certification? Have they looked at these things? Again, this is more about helping you to kind of step through, have they done the right steps in the process? If it's below the ordinary high, has a DNR permit been acquired? And if the activity is exempt from the DNR permit, they're getting a permit from you. There's a page in our quick guide, and we've got a link to the quick guide here. This talks about the situations where we don't have a floodway, and a reminder that you have to look at allowable rise. When a floodway has not been established, you look at, would it cause less than half a foot of rise, because that's the most rise you can cause cumulatively. So you've got to take into consideration any projects. Other projects have already happened in the area since your first FEMA maps came out. And again, that you can't cause any rise if existing buildings will be impacted. Getting into conditional use permits, in some of our older sample ordinances, we showed some things that were requiring a CUP that our current model ordinance doesn't show. So you may require a CUP for any kind of grading in the floodway. In our more current ordinance, we still will talk about CUPs for any structure, that park shelter that's going to be accessory to an open space use. But for any other kind of grading, there's not state rule that says you need the CUP. So that'd be something you could do with a regular permit unless in your ordinance it says a CUP is required. In the flood fringe is where we're going to see most of the CUPs, because we do have the state rules saying if you're using an alternative elevation method, if you're not elevating on fill, you need a conditional use permit for residential buildings. And again, if you've got an older ordinance, we did have language saying a CUP was needed for non-residential buildings, but the state rule again only says it's required for residential buildings. So we've removed that requirement in more recent versions of our model ordinance. Another reason that you might be looking at a CUP is if they're doing dry flood proofing for a non-residential building and you've got an older model, or you've got an ordinance that was based on our older model. Basically showing, again, that in the more recent sample ordinance, we've tried to make clear whether it's actually required by state law to have it be a CUP or not. But some communities, and that was why it was in the older versions of the ordinance, was many communities wanted DNR assistance in looking at, is this going to meet the no rise, and is this something we can allow? And so if you want to have it in your ordinance, you can do that. But we'll also help you if it's a regular permit, not just for CUPs. And it would require a rule change to not require a CUP or special use permit for those residential buildings. In the floodway, there are things that we allow. You can have a little path along the river there like this, but be aware that there can be damages. And again, you're looking at any grading that you're doing and making sure it doesn't cause a rise. But with the conditional use standards, you're still looking at, does it meet the no rise if it's in a floodway? And if it does cause a rise, they have to get a conditional letter of map revision before they can do the project. And that is an expensive and lengthy process. It's at least 6 months, more likely a year, and can be tens of thousands of dollars to go through that process. So people usually avoid that as much as they can. You are still looking at erosion sedimentation concerns. Where you might use it in the floodway would be to again, floodproof those structures that are accessory to an open space use, and where it's a public area or area with employees, if you're putting in, say, a parking lot or trails within a floodway, you might be able to do that and show the no rise. But there's language saying if it's a public area or like a parking area, that you need to have a warning system or enough time for evacuation and enough time to remove anything that's stored in that area. We do have language that, in addition to looking at the no rise, that if they're in the floodway, and this language is also in the flood fringe area, but they're below the base flood elevation, there's language that says any facility that's going to be used by employees or the general public must be designed with a flood warning system that allows for adequate time for evacuation. If you take the depth of the flooding times the velocity in feet per second, and that would be more than 4. So if it's, say, a foot deep and up to 4 feet per second, that's the 4, or 2 feet deep in flooding and up to 2 feet per second, that's okay. But if you get into deeper, faster waters, then you've got to have that flood warning system and make sure you've got adequate time to get everybody out of there. So here's our example of the open-sided structure. It's in a floodway, but they could show it wouldn't cause a rise. They've got their utilities elevated above the regulatory flood protection elevation. They would have enough warning time to come get their picnic tables out of there. Here's what it looks like This was a 50-year flood in this particular photo, but making sure that, again, that they're well anchored, they're above that regulatory flood protection elevation with their utilities, and they've got enough warning time. And in this example, they do. Whether your community should allow some of these things, allow CUPs for some of these things, really depends on your situation. And this is showing an increase going from stage of 11 up to 23 in like 12 hours, really fast. If you've got a really bouncy stream, and this is on the North Fork or the Zumbro in this example, you don't have time to do the evacuations, to get stuff out of there. You're going to be really limited on what you're going to allow, even with a CUP in your floodplain. Here we've got a little bit more warning time. We've got several days of warning time. That's not too bad. So we've got time to do things, and these are places where we've got the warning gauges that the National Weather Service has. The look of it's a little different now as of last year, but they've still got this same basic information available where they're forecasting what the flood elevations are going to be in some places around the state. You got a little time. Or if you're on the Mississippi or the Red River or the Minnesota River, you usually have some good information on the forecasts and a week or two of warning time. So you might have more things that you would consider allowing versus someone on a flashy stream. Let's move on to talking about the flood fringe and typical CUP examples. Again, a residential structure, if you're not elevating on fill, if you're using one of these alternative elevation methods, that does require a conditional use permit. So if they're going up on stilts, pilings, perimeter walls, parallel walls, whatever, that's going to need a CUP. And then it's optional to have it be a CUP for some of these other situations, like if you're going to allow a non-residential structure to do dry floodproofing, that's something that you can have as a CUP, but you don't necessarily have to for non-residential buildings. You would still work with DNR and making sure it's meeting those minimum requirements and probably referencing the FEMA technical bulletins and guidance. Many communities had chosen to say that fill in excess of 1,000 cubic yards that wasn't associated with buildings, that should be a CUP. And that was put in our model ordinance years ago at the request of communities because they were having to deal with dredge spoil or gravel mines or some of these things where they wanted to get a better understanding of what was going to be going on and making sure that that fill was staying in the flood fringe. It wasn't approaching into the floodway and doing things that hadn't been evaluated. So here's an example, and these are images that are in our model ordinance now showing the piling kind of situation. Most often we're seeing that with manufactured homes. We see occasionally in the other kinds of buildings that are elevated on pilings, but we don't have much coastal construction. We will be getting our first coastal areas in St. Louis County here at the end of March, and they will only be allowed to have buildings that are on pilings in the coastal areas. But where we see it most commonly is with the manufactured homes, and then they might put some skirting around there of some kind. We are seeing occasionally those perimeter walls where they'll do like a basement kind of construction, the cinder block or block of some kind, but then they put in flood openings to meet the requirements. So this is a cross-sectional view. I'll have some photos of that typical construction. And then something that we're starting to see a little bit more of is folks going with these stem walls, where they're doing the compacted fill, putting their lowest floor on top of that fill. So stem walls are becoming more common. Right now needs to have the CUP because they don't have the 15 foot of fill around that building that our state rules currently require for residential buildings. And a reminder, what is the lowest floor? It is the walking surface of that lowest enclosed area. And that does include basements or crawl spaces. If you're using that alternative elevation method, then the wording says that you don't count that as the lowest floor. You would then, like in this example here, you could have that above grade crawl space or a full level parking area. Then the official lowest floor for regulatory purposes is that next level up. So the standards for dry floodproofing, it's only allowed for non-residential buildings, and it needs to be certified by a professional engineer who's got that structural engineering background. Those alternative elevation methods, if they're meeting the requirement in FEMA's Technical Bulletin 1, in that FEMA Technical Bulletin 1, it lays out standards that you can meet without doing a design specific for that building. If you're not following the minimum standards that are in Technical Bulletin 1, it's got to be designed by a professional engineer or qualified architect. Most architects are not familiar with those requirements. So really you're looking at a structural engineer being involved. And we'll talk about non-conversion agreements a little bit later. In some cases, you might need an evacuation plan. That's something that we'll talk about also. And if it is a CUP, you do need to notify DNR at least 10 days before the public hearing, and a public hearing is required for that CUP process. But we really encourage you to talk to us earlier in the process, 10 days before. If you're waiting until 10 days before the hearing, they're probably pretty far down the planning process, and we really encourage you to bring us in when they're first talking to you about their options, because we can be looking at maybe some options they aren't aware of or you're not aware of earlier in the process. Otherwise, you might get to 10 days before the hearing and we're telling you, no, you can't do that. That's not allowed by your ordinance. And they've wasted a lot of time and money and effort in going down a road that isn't allowed. And we really want them to look at, what are your goals? How can we do that and be compliant with the local ordinance? Switching into talking about floodproofing a little bit more, our current state rules still reference the 1972 Corps of Engineer floodproofing regulations. In Minnesota Rules 1335, we're in the process of getting those updated to reference to be based on ASCE 2414. Unfortunately, that still is in process. And the next version of this just came out here in like November, December 24. So in the not too distant future, we'll be talking about ASCE 2424 because it came out in the year 24. And this one came out in 2014. So when we're talking about dry floodproofing versus wet floodproofing, dry floodproofing is where they're building that impenetrable barrier there so that the pressure of the water can come up on that wall and build up the pressure, and it's built strong enough to hold up to that pressure. And you need to be looking at the pressure coming from underneath also. I remember reading a document City of Afton had, and they were talking about, we've got these levees and they did a pretty good job of keeping the water back, but we had all these slabs in our basements and in our buildings that came up because of the pressure, because the water was seeping underneath through the sandy soils there and pushing up on those slabs. So a proper dry floodproofing design, they're usually thicker concrete with rebar in there, and that engineer's looking at the kind of pressure you expect for the height of water that you're anticipating for that structure. And in the old 72 floodproofing regs, you'll see reference to FP1, FP2, FP3, FP4. We've removed those references in our more recent model ordinances, but if you've got a really old ordinance, you might see these references. FP1 and 2 are dry floodproofing and whether it involved human intervention or not. And the FP3 or FP4 were wet floodproofing, where the FP3, it was all automated. You didn't need any human intervention. FP4 would be there's some kind of human intervention. And one example I know of is some of the old restaurants that were in the floodplain. They would purposely flood the lower levels of their buildings with the clean water so that they didn't have the floodwaters getting in there. They didn't use vents. They wanted the clean water for easier cleanup afterwards. But the automated vents that allowed for equalizing of pressure are what we'll be talking about here. So again, the water, as it gets higher, you get more and more pressure against that wall. And if you don't have a strong enough wall, it's going to burst. It's going to push that wall in. So the idea of that vent is as the water comes up, you don't go up too far before you've got this place where the vent is, and you equalize the pressure so that the pressure of the water is the same on both sides of that wall. And you don't have something like this happening. And unfortunately, we've got many pictures like this in Minnesota in those floods that were going on, especially over in the Red River Valley during the 97 flood and other floods that impacted older buildings where they weren't thinking about this when they put in their basements or put in crawl spaces. So we're trying to design it so that that wall will stand up to the flooding you expect. We talk about that wet floodproofing with our small accessory structures in our. This is something that's allowed with a normal permit, doesn't need a CUP, but it's the same requirements that it's anchored. You've got flood resistant materials up to the regulatory flood protection elevation. Any utilities are above the regulatory flood protection elevation. And you've got these automatic openings. So wet floodproofing, again, accessory structures up to that 576 square feet. And the 576 square feet, that's a 24 by 24 two-car garage is what that's based on. That's why they've got that weird number here. But when we're talking about residential structures or other types of structures besides just a one-level, one-car garage or two-car garage, that's when we're going to look at FEMA's Technical Bulletin 1. Which is the requirements for flood openings in foundation walls and walls of enclosures. And yep, there it says Technical Bulletin 1. And this gets into a lot of nice details in here. Here they're showing an example of a crawl space. The floor on at least one side needs to be at the same grade as on the outside. They can't have a basement. They can't be below grade on all sides. And I see Jess is asking about how are folks adapting to deal with accessory dwelling units. And that's something where, say you've got a full level garage and you're putting some habitable space above that. That's where you could be using this alternative elevation method. And they could be doing the wet floodproofing of the parking portion and putting a unit above. And we might have some better pictures that could show that. But again, it can't be a basement, and FEMA defines a basement as being below grade on all sides. And it doesn't matter if it's a full level or a crawl space, and FEMA defines crawl space being up to 5 feet tall. And once you're over 5 foot in that lower level, they consider that a full level. So again, it's got to be built in accordance with this Technical Bulletin 1, or you can have a professional engineer look at the design. And you need to be using the flood resistant materials. Oh, and this is a reminder that there is a spot in the Technical Bulletin 1 where they talk about something called Technical Bulletin 11, where they show below grade up to like 2 feet. That is not applicable in Minnesota. They've got some weird exemptions that they got out in like Washington and Oregon, that part of the country. Those are not allowed in Minnesota. And it does say on that page only where it's allowed by local ordinance. Technical Bulletin 2 gets into more details about what is considered flood resistant materials. And this bulletin, they just updated. I just found out about that last week. So this is the cover of the brand new bulletin, came out in January. And I'll tell you that in the old bulletin, they broke things into like 5 different categories of what was meeting the flood resistant material requirements. Now they just have acceptable, unacceptable. And I think they've done some updating of the kind of materials that are used in building. I haven't fully vetted the whole document, but make sure that you know that that new one is out there. So here's an example where they do have the full level. They've got some parking here. And this is a situation where you've got to be careful and monitoring that they're not turning this lower level stuff outside of the parking into habitable space. They've got the flood resistant materials up to the, in this case, Illinois, they've got a higher standard above the national also. I don't remember what their requirement is. But for us, it would be making sure we're up to the regulatory flood protection elevation. And these openings are here, and they need to be on at least 2 sides of the building. But let's go back to the question about if you did have, say, maybe you just had a garage and they wanted to do the accessory dwelling units and go there, maybe they're going to expand over a garage, or you've just got a standalone garage and you want to be adding that unit. You could do that. You just have to make sure that that lower level is only used for parking and access to the upper level and maybe some limited storage, but not habitable space. Here's a view that we've got this also on our quick guide, but this is showing that the interior grade of above grade crawl space. They've got their flood opening, and a reminder that all the utilities, including your ductwork, have to be above the regulatory flood protection elevation. And FEMA really started focusing on ducts, I'd say in the last 10 years, because there were so many floods where water got in the ductwork and then it sat there for a while, and you had terrible sick houses, mildew, mold, all kinds of nasty stuff that was developing. So they're really focused on that. And for our community rating system communities, they needed to be demonstrating that they were showing all those utilities, including the ductwork, were meeting the higher standards, at least a foot above the flood elevation. So if you're meeting the Minnesota minimums, you're meeting that as long as you've got the language clarifying that all that has to be above the RFPE. And we did make that clear in our model ordinance a few years ago. So again, those vents can't be more than a foot above either the exterior or the interior. So if you've got maybe a built-up floor on the inside, you can be measuring from that higher floor on the inside. And for every square foot enclosed, you need a square inch of auto opening. So if your garage is the 576 square feet, you need 576 square inches of automatic opening. And you do need to look at if it's a vent that has bars in there, you have to subtract the area of the bars and look at just the net opening there. And only the area below the base flood elevation will count as being the open area. Now, a lot of times in Minnesota, we want our garages or these areas to be insulated. So a good option is to get an engineered vent. There's different companies that have that. These look like Smart Vents, a particular company, but there's other companies that have them. They have models that are made for going in garage doors or for going in the side of the house. And the most typical model we'll see is one that it says in the certification forms for that model that each of these are the equivalent of 200 square inches. So in some cases, you might have only the engineered vents. Other cases, you might have a mix of them. And the newest FEMA elevation certificate allows for the surveyor to account for a mix of engineered openings or the other openings. That here's a guide that talks about other kinds of openings and talks about what the equivalent opening size is for those. When you're inspecting those buildings, you're making sure that they have enough of the vents, they're high enough, and you're inspecting. Is that within a foot? That doesn't look like it's within a foot. In some of the states, they also go around to looking for blue lights, see if they've got TVs on at night to see if they're using those spaces incorrectly, if they have like a full level enclosure. Here's an example where we're looking at the vents, and these were actually other kinds of vents, but it's still a nice example showing here's a vent that they've wired shut. That is not automatic opening, and that's something you need to be checking. And you want to make sure that they are in there. And I have to tell a quick story about my counterpart in Wisconsin a few years back. He was dealing with a violation, helping a community deal with a violation, and he was checking out the price of vents on eBay and found some that were on sale, and in the ad it said only used to pass the inspection, the building inspection, and it's been in storage ever since. So that is not compliant if you only have them in and then you take them out after the inspection's done, or you finish the walls in that area and they're not functioning. So you do need to be ensuring that they're meeting that. In our model ordinance, we recommend, it's not a state law, but we strongly recommend that you have the language in there saying that they must have a deed restricted non-conversion agreement that allows for periodic inspections. We do have a sample non-conversion agreement. They're signing saying they understand they can't convert it to habitable space. It can only be used for parking, access to the upper levels, limited storage, that they're going to allow the community to do periodic inspections, and that those flood openings must remain open and functioning. And you want it tied to the property legally in some way. We actually took an example that state of Mississippi had, because they deal with those a lot, and just made a few updates for Minnesota. So here's a couple of the situations where you don't have to have the vents. Would be if the lowest floor is above the BFE but below the RFPE, because your lowest floor needs to be at the RFPE and the vent requirements up to the BFE. On manufactured homes, they might have those pilings, and if they have the actual flexible skirting, not something that is rigid, but the flexible skirting that will allowing water to equalize, or the stem wall situation here. And that's what you don't want. So FEMA's got quite a few references, and I see I forgot to get the links to these. We'll find that for the follow-up. And by the way, I will send copies of these slides as a PDF out to all those who registered for this training. Just a note that for insurance, the non-residential buildings that have wet or dry floodproofing, they would take the height of the floodproofing and subtract a foot, and that would be how they rated the height of the dry floodproofing. A couple more documents talking about some resources there. There are things you could do to reduce risk that they won't meet your current update standards, but if it's an existing non-conforming building, here they've got a sunken patio and they've got some slots here so they can put in some barriers. Here they've built up around their window well. This is some information we've got in our quick guide, encouraging at least elevating your furnace, your water heater. Those are the things that get damaged the most. Or you might have language in your ordinance that says if the furnace or water heater or other utilities are damaged due to a flood, that they must be elevated. Otherwise, the state minimum only requires those elevations if they have substantial damage or substantial improvements. Common oversights are not keeping adequate documentation of that elevation, and you need to keep it for the life of the building, or not processing it as a CUP when that is those alternative elevation methods, not enforcing regulations when it's just outside the MAP floodplain, but below the BFE, that state requirement, not issuing a local permit when DNR permit is not required. That if there's not a DNR permit, then you need to issue a local permit. Nationally, the most common things are machinery, equipment not being properly elevated, vents not being properly located and sized, and whether to give a variance. And boy, I took more time than I thought I would today. So let's go through this pretty quickly, but want to look at, are you putting your first responders at risk by the variance that you're going to give? Here's an example in the Las Vegas area. And that fire truck got stuck in that intersection. They had to come rescue them. Not a good situation. So for floodplain, in addition to meeting practical difficulty, we have to meet exceptional hardship. That's what's in the federal code. A reminder that if there's a variance, the area hydrologist, and we ask that you also copy the floodplain staff, we need 10 days advance notice, and we should be hearing what your decision is after a variance. And you need that record of decision. There is language that if you were to give a variance, you have some specific flood insurance implications that needs to be in there. And you need to keep those records. I'm not going to go into details here on variances. We have separate trainings talking about variances, what's practical difficulty, what are the criteria that they need to be meeting to get a variance in the first place, and addressing each of those, making sure any conditions are enforceable in the long term. And we do have more resources on variances. But a reminder that if you've got existing nonconformities, they lose their rights if they're discontinued or abandoned for more than a year. And there's language that came in 2004 that said if they're destroyed by fire or other peril, including flooding, by more than 50% of the market value, so they're substantially damaged, that if they applied for a permit within 180 days, they could go rebuild where they were. And that might be the case for your shoreland situations. And there's some wording about still pulling them back and reducing the risk. But in 2005, we added language saying that they must regulate to maintain eligibility in the National Flood Insurance Program. That's in the state statute there, that they, even if they apply for that permit within 180 days, that they still need to meet the minimum elevations, because if they don't, they've been substantially damaged, then that's not compliant. Your community can get kicked out of the National Flood Insurance Program. And then we still got the no increase in flood damage potential, no increase in the degree of obstruction. For most things, variances are prohibited. You can't give a variance for a new building in the floodway or expansion of the building in the floodway. You cannot allow for a lowest floor than the regulatory flood protection and elevation. You cannot cause any increase in flood elevations and obstruct flood flows. The most common variances we'll see are to that 15 foot of fill. We actually have an info sheet in our various section on that situation. And the other thing we'll sometimes see is if you've got that higher standard for access requirement, you could consider a variance if they've got adequate warning time or their depth times velocity is not too great. And there's some special wording that FEMA has come out with on flood proofing of ag structures. And they've got a whole bunch of guidance on that. So some of those, they're bigger than the 576 square feet. Certain uses of ag structures, so storage of equipment, not places where you've got animals, not places where you're storing hazardous materials. But if you've got a situation like that, you can talk to us more and we can look at the guidance that FEMA has here. FEMA does have overall variance guidance. Here we've got links to our variance training that we did a couple years ago. Had a focus on shoreland, but a lot of it's good for floodplain also. And we did another training on nonconformities in shoreland and floodplain. Just a reminder that if communities show a pattern of giving improper variances or just doing a bad job of administering their floodplain ordinances, they can be suspended from the flood insurance program. Usually they get put on probation, and we work with them because we really don't want you getting kicked out of the program. We really want that protection at the local level. You can also be suspended if you don't adopt new maps within the 6 months of your letter of final determination. And to get back in, you've got to be showing that you're doing everything right, that you haven't allowed anything illegal in the meantime. So non-participation, suspension means that nobody can get flood insurance. You have to get flood insurance from Lloyd's of London, similar companies. You can't get individual assistance if there's been a lot of damage to homes and businesses and there's been a federal declaration. Public assistance, you're only eligible for the emergency response debris removal stuff. You're not eligible for rebuilding roads, public buildings, utilities, culverts, all those kinds of things. And you're not eligible for a lot of grants and loans that for projects that impact the mapped areas. Defendable in court, if you've got your ordinance, you're protecting people, life and safety kinds of things, the courts uphold those. The times when courts don't uphold is you did not enforce your regulations and someone was impacted. That by far is when communities lose in court. And you can predict more likely when you're going to see flooding. So we've got science behind it. ASFPM, the Associated State Floodplain Managers, has had great resources over the years. Going back, here's an 84 example. They just more recently came out in 23 with some guidance on the legal aspects aimed at local communities. Oh, this was our new state seal. This was in the crop art at the fair last year, and I thought that was pretty cool. Okay, I see that Ricky put in the link to the no-rise certification. Thanks, Sarah. There weren't many questions at this point.